session. Ooh, we have a recording in progress. And so with that, if I can get a roll call.
All righty. Director Kimball.
Here.
Chair Long.
Here.
Vice Chair McFadden.
Here.
Director Minigan.
Here.
Director Pace.
Here.
Director Villaseñor.
Here.
Perfect.
All right. Are there any, we're all here in attendance. Are there any public comments? And seeing none, we will move to the approval of the agenda. If I can get a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
That's been first by Director Minigan, and a second, please.
Second.
Okay, that's been first and second, and if I could have a roll call, please.
Okay, Director Kimball.
Aye.
Chair Long.
Yes.
Vice Chair McFadden.
Aye.
Director Minigan.
Aye.
Director Pace.
Yes.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
Perfect.
All right. Motion has been approved for the agenda, so that is good. Next is our update from legal counsel.
Good evening, all. I do not have any update for this meeting.
Oh, that's nice. I appreciate that. And therefore, there's no updates. We can move now to our big item for the night, which is the sustainable management criteria development. I'll hand it off to Tony Emmerich first, and then to Tony Morgan.
Good evening, Chair Long and board. I'll just tee up a little bit in that we have been attempting to answer some of the questions that came up at our last couple meetings. We were able to have some useful meetings with Department of Water Resources. We also had some comments on other earlier GSPs that came out that provided some helpful information. And so we have a recommendation to put before you on the SMC that we're considering. And so I'll just hand it over quickly to Tony Morgan. I did want to note that I believe Director Pace told us last meeting that he needs to leave in about an hour.
Yes.
And Chair Long needs to leave sometime after that. So we'll try to launch right in.
Okay, so thanks everybody for being here this evening. We'll try to get through what presentation we have here tonight and get on to the discussion portions of it as well. So the sustainability matrix, you've seen what feels like 100 times there, and we've got, 4 of those items that we've got consensus from the board on, and so we're not going to talk about those anymore this evening. We're going to focus our attention on the surface water depletion as it deals with GDEs and groundwater elevation for the same thing. So let's move on with that. We've got, as Tony Emmerich just said, we've had the opportunity to have a couple of working sessions since the last meeting. And we worked on these to define some basic facts and things on which the groups can agree, and to discuss some ideas on how to deal with setting MTs associated with the GDEs. Both of these sessions had in-depth discussions of what we know and don't know. The sessions lasted about 1.5 hours each. The first one was our internal GSP team, and you can see who the composition of that was. And then we also had the opportunity to chat with DWR, and specifically it was Tim Ross and Jack Tung sitting with us and learning about our 2 basins and the issues that we're facing, and then offering some guidance and thoughts from their perspective as the regulator. So DWR asked some particularly good questions about how the basin operates during wet and dry periods. So this was one of our opportunities to let them know that we don't operate like their guidance documents suggest basins operate, where during periods of drought, they go down and they never come back and they never come back. We talked about how we go down in drought periods and we come back during wet periods. And we're in this cyclic situation that we have decades of information to confirm that that's really how the basin operates. It was an opportunity to reemphasize that. They wanted to know what information we had on the rising groundwater efforts. We gave them a review of many of the PowerPoint slides that this board and stakeholders have seen at the last few meetings and workshops. DWR was very complimentary of the GSP team's efforts to try to find a way to address the difficult task of setting an MT in this situation, and noted that it was obvious that we were giving due consideration to the environmental impacts. So what were the conclusions or findings? I'm not going to take time to go a comment by comment summary, but instead have listed some of the major takeaways here. The team here, and we're talking about our internal team in this instance, thought that using the critical water level concept was appropriate for the groundwater elevation sustainability indicator for vegetation. So to refresh everyone's memories, the critical water level is that concept that was put forth by the UCSB researcher Kibler, who came and gave a presentation to this board and basically came up with the concept that when water levels fall more than about 10 feet below the 2011 height or 2011 water level, then we start to see accelerated stress on the vegetation. So we're using that concept and we're calling that 10-foot water level below the 2011 value as our critical water level. And so in talking with Stillwater, we batted around the idea of said, well, okay, what if we were to do an MT and we said, when the water level crosses or declines below the critical water level, then we'll wait 12 months. And if things haven't recovered or begun to recover at least, then we will implement the concept of trying to provide supplemental groundwater to that area. They were a little uneasy with that and preferred what I think is a more refined approach to that. So basically the concept we're advancing tonight is that when the water level declines below the critical water level, the GSA will continue to monitor that water level through the subsequent rainy period, the subsequent winter, to see how much precipitation occurs. If the water levels have not recovered to the critical water level by the end of the subsequent rainy period, so for example, let's just say by May 1st, then the supplemental water from a nearby deep well will be supplied to California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the CDFW, to use in the manner they deem most beneficial at the Cienega project site. So in this case, the critical water level becomes your MT, with mitigation being initiated if that MT stays below that level through a subsequent rainy season, what we hope is a rainy season. The team came to 3 fundamental conclusions with respect to the surface water depletion associated with the pools. Again, no readily identifiable way to mitigate the loss of rising groundwater due to pumping or evaporation, or to mitigate water temperature increases as well. And they also commented that there were no documented occurrences of spawning or rearing in the isolated reaches. So we didn't get to the point where we felt we could set an MT or a draft MT for the surface water depletion, but these are important grounding concepts that we can use to help us go forward into our subsequent meeting, which was with DWR. And so, like that previous meeting, we came up with some guiding conclusions here. They liked the idea of using the critical water level as an appropriate MT for vegetation. They said it's perfectly acceptable to do mitigation, so that the concept of using the pumped groundwater as a supplement was okay as far as their perspective is concerned. Okay, they did particularly like the idea of making CDFW responsible for using the mitigation waters in the most effective manner. And so the concept behind that, a little bit more detail, is that this agency, the GSA, doesn't necessarily need to be in the business of trying to maintain a habitat. That's not your particular focus. It's not centered on your responsibilities, but it is for the professionals at CDFW. And so providing them with an extra tool during drought periods, during particularly stressful periods to the vegetation, was an idea that they thought had quite a bit of merit. Get that decision off of this GSA about how to effectively use that water and give it to the professionals at CDFW and let them make the decision of the most beneficial way to use it. We talked about the impacts of pumping on groundwater levels and that kind of thing. And they spent a lot of time looking at the various PowerPoint slides, and we were flipping back and forth with them, giving them the opportunity to stare at them for a few minutes and interpret those graphs for themselves. But basically, they came to the same conclusion that we have here in previous board meetings, that massive pumping reductions, remember we're talking about reductions greater than 50% as an example, don't resolve the issue that we're dealing with, but probably do create other significant and unreasonable impacts to other users of those groundwater resources. They did like the idea that for the supplemental water being supplied to the Cienega, they were asking, how are you going to monitor the effect on the water level there? And we reminded them that we do have a grant that has monitoring well monies associated with that, and that at least a couple of shallow monitoring wells funded by the grant were in our plans to be constructed at that site. So they were pleased to hear that we were thinking ahead and able to provide a monitoring program, or at least monitoring locations near those sites. The DWR acknowledged that the GSA has no control over when droughts occur, the water temperature, or evaporation from pools in those isolated reaches. After our, I'll call them extensive discussions and review of many of those PowerPoint slides and charts, etc., their takeaway was that the future conditions, meaning that is the amount of rising groundwater lost to pumping, is not materially different in the future than what we see in the historical conditions. They went on to remind us that the GSA is not under obligation to make the conditions better than in 2015. They also reminded us that this sigma does not mean that there cannot be impacts, but that we should avoid those that are significant and unreasonable. So important, nuanced reminders from DWR. Given the particular circumstances in these basins, they suggested not setting an MT for this indicator. They commented that we would need to provide DWR with a very complete picture of the conditions in the basin and our analyses. And they advised us, I guess is the appropriate word, that you have the data to support this. You just need to make a very clear picture so that a DWR reviewer who may not be familiar with these basins can understand what we're talking about. So that's a summary of the DWR meeting. I thought just some people may not know where the Cienega project, sometimes called Cienega Springs project, but basically here's the fish hatchery. Red dash line is the approximate boundary between the Piru Basin and the Fillmore Basin. And so you can see the black line here kind of outlining the Cienega project area. So again, there's the fish hatchery. So just to give you some geographic context of where we're talking about. So if we take a look at the matrix again, but I've included only those indicators that deal with elevation and depletion here. we've taken the essence of those findings from the 2 meetings and offered up some language in the matrix here that encompasses those findings. The elevation SMC has been divided into 2 parts, one dealing with the loss of the ability to pump. That's the one we've talked about previously. And then the second one dealing with GDE vegetation die-off. And so the MT for the vegetation is a vegetation-oriented component, uses the critical water level that we discussed and encompasses the mitigation action, that being the supplemental water pumped during droughts. And so that's why we've got an asterisk here, and this comes over and provides a little more explanation for tonight's meeting. We put in a groundwater elevation of the 2011 high as an MO. I think everybody knows that 2011 represented conditions that were basin full like in both of the basins. And so as a measurable objective of somewhere we would like to be, we would like to have the basin full all the time. So it's not something that we can necessarily control, but that is the measurable objective, is to get to there. The surface water depletion indicator, again, is focused on the rising groundwater in the vicinity of the fish hatchery. An MT is not proposed, following the line of logic discussed with DWR, that the future conditions are not materially different than the historical. Okay, again, MO prescribed in here at the 2011 high. I think that works as well for this, or at least for discussion purposes tonight. So that's the proposal for the language. I wanted you to see, if we talk about the supplemental water being supplied, if we were to look at our situation right now going forward. So here we are, 2020 out here, we're just coming out of this drought, or we think we are, but maybe we're back in it, who knows, with the conditions we have right now. But going forward, you can see that there are multiple years. It's the drought years where we would be in a position, if we adopted those mitigative measures, that there would be multiple years in which we would be supplying water. So it's not necessary at this point in time, it's not necessary this evening to have this mitigation plan, if you will, fully developed. We don't have to know what well, how much water, how's it going to get there. We don't need to have that level of specificity today for the completion of this GSP. What we do need is buy-in from the board that this is a concept that they want to move forward with, and then we can write that into the GSP. The details of how that program would operate could be postponed and put into the years 1 through 5 after filing the GSP, where you actually develop a mitigation plan and say how you're going to operate it. So it's not necessary to have all the details tonight. Just the idea that the board's consensus is that, yes, let's go forward this concept for the purposes of this drought. I've got this slide, but I don't think we need to talk about it right now. So one of the things we'd mentioned was what kind of well, or where would this supplemental water come from? Again, this decision does not need to be made. However, there's some general criteria that we can say is that we want the candidate well, if possible, we want it existing, so we have to drill a new one. But let's presume it's existing. It's perforated in a deeper aquifer, not in the shallow zone. Okay, we don't want to be recycling the water in the shallow zone. We don't want that pumped well to have an impact on the shallow aquifer. It should be located, quote, near the Cienega. And it's got to be available for use during drought periods. If the water levels fall too much, or if the owner of the well says, no, I can't, I need that well every day, every day of the week, it's not available for use, then that would not be a candidate well. So here we looked around, and here's an example of a well. This doesn't mean that this is the well we're suggesting we're using. We're just saying, okay, here's a possible candidate. It's screened 300 to 600 feet down. It's got an active status, but apparently it rarely pumps in this recent history. So we don't know if that means that the well still exists and is functional. It's still listed as active, and we don't know if it's accessible. But the point being, it's not too far from the Cienega project area, which actually sticks out here a little bit and gets very reasonably close to this well. But that's the kind of candidate well that we would be looking for. Again, we're not picking that well. I'm just using it as an example of the kinds of criteria we might use to identify a well. So again, I don't need all the details worked out, just need consensus that this is approach or some modification that we make tonight is the approach that we can go forward with. And then after the GSP is prepared and after we've had an ability and time to consult with CDFW and learn about the status of their project and our meaning the agency's willingness to provide supplemental water during a drought, then we work on a mitigation plan. And that's where we'll get into the details and come back to the board at a later date with a mitigation plan that gives you more of the nitty gritty of how it would go on. So that's all I want to say tonight, and leave it open for the board to discuss.
Dan, I've got a couple of questions, but I think Candace had her hand up first.
Yeah, hi. So Tony, I want to first say thank you for listening to the Nature Conservancy's feedback with regards to groundwater elevation and splitting the undesirable results to highlight the GDEs.
Mm-hmm.
And also having these discussions with DWR to get their input. You know, on one of your previous slides, you said there isn't a way to mitigate for groundwater pumping. And especially at the Cienega site, that is the case, because we show that when we do model no pumping during droughts, it doesn't have an impact. And so I was just wondering, like a lot of the discussions I've been making and points I've been making is about, okay, how do we make the vegetation resilient? So even if we aren't going to stop pumping to have those undesirable impacts on ag and municipalities, how can we make our GDEs resilient? And so I understand that the supplemental water is a way to mitigate, but I'm just thinking, would the board entertain an additional option of providing funding so that we can do non-native species removal? Because it's when there are droughts, the invasives move in, and we as a board recognize that, you know, Arundo and Tamar is establishing itself when there's die-off of native riparian forest is going to make it more difficult for that native plant vegetation and community to be resilient throughout a drought, but it also has further negative impacts on our water supply. So I'm wondering if whether it's in the mitigation plan or in the comments, we entertain the potential for a fund to build up the resilience of our GDE populations. And then my other question with regards to the mitigation plan is do you think we would be able to develop a draft for the GSP draft, or is that not a possibility? Because I mean, I don't think it should be horribly complicated, but do you think we'd be able to put the mitigation plan in the draft GSP too? Or is that more of a 1 to 5 year scale?
I think partly we could come up with some concepts, but I think the details of it are going to have to wait till we see where CDFW's program evolves to at the Cienega project. They're still in, I've forgotten what % design now. Was it 65% design? I don't remember, but something like that. And so we need to see where they end up. And then we also have to have some kind of consultation with them to say, here's our idea. Does this look like it would be beneficial to you? And I think we have a meeting with them scheduled, Tony.
Would we not need to get an indication from them before the GSP? Because, you know, we can't, what if they're not interested? I'm not saying they're not going to be, but I'm just saying, we'd want some form of feedback for the draft GSP, not after the GSP, right?
Mm-hmm. And Tony Emmerich, I think we have a meeting with them scheduled for, I've forgotten the date. Is it next week?
Correct.
Okay.
Caroline, if I can add a little bit of information on this, is
Yes,
we
please.
have been working with California Department of Fish and Wildlife on this concept. And I thought we had a meeting Tuesday morning, but some key members from the Los Alamitos office just told me this morning they may not be able to make it. So they've asked us to reschedule. But the purpose of that meeting would be to get to be able to discuss these issues with both the fish hatchery property manager and the Cienega restoration manager, as well as the regulatory end of CDFW. And we would like to try to work with their ongoing hatchery operation, their Cienega project, and to pitch this concept for the mitigation project, the joint mitigation project, and also to work with them on siting at least 2 monitoring wells out there. So it's been a little tough to get a whole bunch of different people together, but yes, we are committed to working out this concept and bringing it back to the board. I would advise maybe we flush out the concept as much as possible. I'm hoping and assuming that if this board is supportive of the concept and CDFW is, that we can at least flesh out the outline of this to be included in our GSP. I think DWR would like to see a description of this, but do I think they need to have, plan, specs, and estimate? No, I don't. And Dan just pointed out to me, thank you, Dan, that Stillwater is involved in both, our consulting team for the GSA, but Stillwater is also working with CDFW on the Cienega project.
Yeah.
So one of the people that we were trying to get to the meeting was Bruce Orr and his team, so he can advise us both on how this might work. And Bruce was supportive of this concept. And so we'll report back to you. If the meeting happens early next week, we can report back a little progress at our board meeting next Thursday night.
Okay, I just had I'd like to just get an indication from the other board members about what your feelings are with regards to a fund to help GDEs. I believe in a previous meeting when I was on bereavement leave, Kat Selm at the Nature Conservancy had mentioned the considerable die-off of willows a little bit north of the fish hatchery. And, it's really to follow the planning for the Santa Clara Parkway and restoration efforts that nonprofits are engaged in. And if it can support that Cienega restoration area to be resilient during drought, I think it would be useful to address the invasive non-native species. And then my last comment or question is for Tony Morgan. Tony, this has been very focused on the Cienega side, but there were also areas of rising groundwater further downstream with, with the Fillmore Santa Paula Basin around Lost Creek. And, that's where there's spring-fed input and lower temperatures and anecdotal, mentions of potential steelhead habitat. And I had circulated earlier a research paper about temperature needs in Santa Paula Creek. And, that's on this watershed. And, I'm wondering if in the same way that we would have monitoring wells, monitoring critical groundwater levels, if we could have temperature loggers monitoring stream temperature in that known GDE area, which has been identified as suitable steelhead habitat. And then we can set a critical temperature of like, because the article mentions like 25 to 27 degrees Celsius is where they stop changing their behavior to just manage stress with regards to water levels. At which point we could do something similar with supplemental water if we know that and that would only be in the case of you knew there wasn't presence of steelhead, like you had over summering and spawning species. If the presence absence monitoring indicated that there wasn't steelhead present, then obviously you wouldn't need to do the supplemental water input. But it's just those are two known GDE areas, and I feel like that site's kind of falling off the discussion, off the table with DWR and the matrix setting up minimum thresholds.
If I could, sorry. Go ahead, Ed, and I'll go after.
Okay. First of all, Tony, I just wanted to compliment you and your team and United Staff and everybody else who was involved for reaching out to DWR. And I think the information you brought back from the people who are going to judge our GSP and determine whether or not it's valid is extremely useful. So thank you very much for that. And I think the concepts that you put forward, I think are very good, and I would support them. Candace, you asked for a reaction on an Arundo fund. I think my reaction is that vegetation management in our basins is getting beyond the scope of the GSPs or the GSA. So I'd be very cautious about diving into that. A question I had for Tony is, where is the location? Do you know which well on the map that you showed before is the one that California Department of Fish and Wildlife uses for supplying water to the fish hatchery? I assume it's right next to the.
Director McFadden,
The
I
well's
think
right there
there-
adjacent to the,
Right. Yeah, there are, I think, 3 of
Go ahead.
them there that belong to Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, and all 3 of those could be used to supply water, or used to supply water to the hatchery and have a possibility of other use.
and I think that's one of the things we could talk to CDFW about, the hatchery manager, about how do they use those wells? What pumping rates are there? Do they have excess capacity on their wells that we might be able to put to use during the drought periods and supply water and not have to worry about drilling another well or whatever? Then it's just, if that's possible, we help them re-equip their well accordingly, and then that water is available for them to use during the drought periods.
Interesting.
To go to Director Minigan's comments about the east end of the East Valley, which is the Western Fillmore Basin area there. During our conversations with Stillwater, our sort of little working group there that we had, the feeling was that there is sustainable water there. And so if we got to focus our efforts, and we should focus on efforts on those areas where we think the most severe impacts might occur, that's the Cienega area. It's not the east end, it's not the west end of Fillmore rather, and it's not the Del Valle area as well. So this is really the area that they felt most strongly about us focusing on.
But I mean, it's identified as critical steelhead habitat, and the Steelhead Coalition has said that there's potential over summer rearing habitat and spawning habitat. I kind of feel like until we've done the necessary due diligence of showing that it's not suitable, it can't just be disregarded.
And I hear what you're saying, and I understand, and I think doing some science is okay. I think the question that Director McFadden brought up is how much of that is within the scope of this agency's responsibilities is one that the directors need to wrestle with. And I go back to, I guess I take the long view of these kinds of things. If you find out that the fish are there, what are you going to do differently than if you don't know they're there? How are you going to manage that area any differently with the tools in your toolbox? What are you going to do that's different?
But we know that that site is different to Cienega. Cienega didn't show any, when you did the model runs, any benefit from reducing pumping. It wasn't the case at that site. That site showed a rebound from reducing pumping. And I think we're confusing the two metrics now between the groundwater level for GDE vegetation. I think what Ed was saying is for vegetation management, that's out of the realm. And I'd beg to differ. I'd say that we have identified Aranda removal as a potential project for this agency. So we as a board have discussed the benefits of that. And this would be to make that vegetation resilient because of drought, because we are choosing not to reduce pumping and having an adverse effect on pumping and municipal during a time we know from our model runs it won't have an impact. But we can't disregard that we are having an impact because we are further having an impact on top of the drought because we are pumping. And what I'm saying is you mitigate and you build in resilience for your GDEs for future droughts, because what the USB study showed was, there is an opportunity for vegetation to rebound. And so that's my point, is about building the resilience in. It's not just mitigating, but also building the resilience in. So that's for the vegetation. With regards to surface water, I don't, I get that under Sigma, we have a duty with regards to sustainable groundwater management. But I mean, we are a public agency and we have to comply and not have a negative impact on. So there's like the balancing the undesirable and significant impact of pumping at the East Grove, at the West Fillmore part of the basin. But, there's still the Endangered Species Act, and that is indeed critical steelhead habitat. And we know it's an area of rising groundwater. I mean, if we don't, I would be more comfortable with a minimum threshold with a temperature attached to it, and a mitigation plan with supplemental water to support in the incidences of we know there is a presence of steelhead. There might not be a presence some years, and that supplemental water will not be even required. But the study that I circulated earlier today showed that we have to manage and conserve and it's significant to benefit steelhead around temperature needs on the Santa Clara River watershed. And so, I would strongly recommend a minimum threshold temperature rating for surface water depletion. Because we're a public agency, we also have to comply with the Endangered Species Act. It's not only our jurisdiction under Sigma.
Thank you, Candace. I appreciate your words there, and Tony as well. And I really appreciate talking with DWR as we struggled the last 4 different meetings or more in regards to this issue, or since the very beginning. And to understand DWR's points with Sigma not going outside of what is requested from us, especially for those who are part of this GSA. I do know that IRWM is paying for, with those grants, Aranda removal and looking at that, and also the Santa Clara River Watershed Organization, our Fire Council. There are many different associations that are looking at our environmental species and so forth. And I believe that our group should be working with them if there are grant possible.
We lost you, Kelly.
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Yes. Okay,
Yes.
sorry. My computer and my camera fight each other. I think that you have IRWM, you have the Santa Clara River Watershed groups, you have the Fire Council, you have many organizations in which are looking at the environmental on the river and on the watershed that we should work with, and support any grant opportunities for those projects, just like we are doing right now with the Arundo removal on the whole entire river. I think that's where we should be focused. I wouldn't support actually a fund for this. I think that our strength goes in supporting the grants on that. But I do appreciate DWR stating what they had. I think that will help us move forward, and it's a good baseline. So if we need to change our requirements in 5 years based on the studies that other groups and so forth are doing, then we can. I think what we have right now, I support, and I wouldn't make any other changes to it. So I wanted to make sure that I was direct in that, based on all of the meetings that we have had. And appreciate that Tony and Tony both got this information out to us earlier today so that we could digest it a little bit more before last meeting when we had just heard from DWR. We got to at least hear it a little bit sooner to consume this information. And I think it puts us in the right spot right now based on the other GSAs that have been submitted so far, and their similar processes that they are going through. So that's, I would support what we've got going on. Thank you.
Chair Long, can I make a quick comment?
Yes.
I'll say basically the same thing. Our team, thanks to our team, they've gone out to DWR and asked what it will take. What do they want? It's very simple. They've told us. And so that's their recommendation. So I would certainly continue discussion on the recommendation. And right now I would support that, but I wouldn't go beyond the recommendation from DWR that came from our staff and consultants from DWR. And I'll be quiet and listen to other reports.
Yes. Is there any other board members? I want to make sure I give time to everybody. Glenn, go ahead.
Chair Long, yes. So I think it's interesting and it's new information, and I think it's some real positive things. There left me some questions, and I think on the one side, if I'm hearing it correctly, like Candace had mentioned, part of me wants to have an answer before we submit this plan now, but I also realize that we may need to go some time before we can put that plan completely together, what that mitigation outline would look like. I'm a little curious and a little concerned. In theory, it sounds good to me, but then there's some details where they say the devil's in the details concern me. When we say, yes, we're going to mitigate, what exactly does that mean? How are we talking about mitigating X number of acres of irrigation or a certain quantity of water? Or is that guaranteed every year? Or is it because if we get into a real long drought that we've seen, that we know that we're just affecting the ends of the drought? So hypothetically, if we get into this, 15-year drought, which I think we're going to have bigger problems, do we only supplement for the first 2 or 3 years? And then once we get so far into it, we say, all right, now we cut that off because the drought is doing the problem, not the pumping. And then we bring it on earlier. I don't know if there's a way of distinguishing that, but I would just be a little concerned of we're opening ourselves up to an infinite amount of mitigation and costs and things. At some point, that would cross over from a mitigation to an unreasonable and significant impact to other people, to other shareholders. So I don't know where the balance is. I think that we're going in the right direction. I'm just not sure. I would like to have a lot of information, and I don't think we're going to have all of that when we go to make this first decision. But those are some of the things that jumped out to me as a little bit of a concern. The concept all sounds good, but I feel like I'd like to have as much information as possible when we go to making a decision, at least framework wise, order of magnitude, that kind of stuff, if that makes sense.
Okay, Christina?
Yes. Thank you, Tony. And I just, as the other directors mentioned, I appreciate the meetings that were held too, and the good conclusions, I think, that and clear conclusions that were came up with. Regarding the Arundo, I see, Candace, of where you're coming from in terms of if we are going to be doing that mitigation of having the water flow, and you want to sort of make sure that those things are done in the same way. I agree with that, but also, as Director Long said, if there are numerous agencies that are working on it, I think it will be best to, in this very specific plan of how we may do this mitigation, if we do it, if the board if it comes down to that in the GSP, of trying to have agreements with these different agencies who are working on that, to like you said, if it sort of run them together, right? The water and the Arundo removal, to give the riparian woodlands the best chance. Yeah, and I agree with Director Pace too. I think he made a really good point about what does this look like, right? Like, giving it every year after, excuse me, you go below that critical water level, and then see how the rains come the following year. What level of mitigation is that? I guess you're right. Like, I'm, sort of looking some more details and what that data could possibly be, and will it get to a point of being a lot? So those are sort of things that are running through my head. But I like the information that we received. It does seem, as Director McFadden said, very clear what the DWR is looking for, and I appreciate the understanding and the struggle that we've had in figuring out the MT, and basically allowing us to just give a very clear explanation about that. So that's where I'm at.
And Director Kimball?
Thank you, Chair Long. I also would like to thank Tony Morgan and his team and Tony Emmerich for organizing those meetings. And I think the quality and depth of their work is reflected in the fact that DWR saw the same information that we have seen. And just based on those presentations and that information, was able to give us a recommendation of how we should proceed with particularly the minimum threshold for surface water. I think that we'd be ill-advised to go against their advice, especially with this initial plan. I want to say that I understand that there are a significant number of stakeholders who have a great deal of commitment and passion to the goal of reestablishing steelhead in significant numbers. I've heard numbers of 45,000 a year. So there's some real desire here, and it's clear that, I mean, obviously they're an endangered species, and the Santa Clara River is identified as a critical habitat, as Candace regularly reminds us. And so I think we need to be, we need to be really sensitive to that, and we need to be really aware of that. At the same time, we have a significant number of stakeholders who live in the cities of Fillmore and Piru, and a pretty significant agricultural industry that depends on this surface water. And those stakeholders are watching us as well. And we need to be cognizant of our duties and responsibilities and authorities under Sigma, and make sure that we fulfill those and not overstep our authority and responsibilities. So I would support the proposal in Tony's chart.
Okay. Okay, so I've heard from all the directors. Lisa, there are more questions from the public. Do you want to go ahead and start with reading those? And we'll get some answers.
Sure. Okay. From Lettuce Spencer, what alternative mitigation strategies were investigated or discussed? And Letta, maybe you can clarify, but I'm thinking maybe you mean with regard to the groundwater elevations for the GBEs.
I guess it was earlier in the conversation, and the groundwater pumping as an offset if a minimum threshold was reached.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah, we did look at what impact groundwater pumping has there at the fish hatchery area, as well as over in the Willard Road area on the west end of the Fillmore Basin, and found that groundwater pumping does have some impact, but there's a very heavy, significant overprint of drought conditions that affect those shallow water levels also. And so when we began to ramp down the groundwater pumping, we saw that even when we got to a 50% reduction in groundwater extractions, it still did not correct the or eliminate the impact of pumping. So it would take a very massive reduction in pumping, and we're not sure that would even do it to fix the problem. So we did look at that, a potential option, and it was basically, we would be reducing people's pumping to that level would impose significant and unreasonable impacts on others as well. So
I really appreciate that you took the extra mile to understand the alternative strategies and how those would have a, as you mentioned, an undesirable result as well, and kind of picking something that was reasonable.
Thank you. Next one.
Next one is from Brian Bondi. Is it correct to conclude from the chart that the GSA would provide mitigation water for 21 consecutive years in one part of the chart? It seems at some point during that period that pumping is no longer really a factor that needs to be addressed. I think this kind of reiterates Dr. Pace's question.
Right, and I totally agree with that. There's at some point that water's not probably being used as effective, and I think that's an issue that should be wrestled with in the mitigation plan, and we work with CDFW to determine where that break point is, where it's not really it's not achieving the beneficial effects that we would want it to achieve, and we've gone beyond the mitigation of just the impacts of the pumping, and now we're doing something else. We're after the drought impacts as well. So we'd have to go back and tease that information a little bit more and then see what we could pull out, but work with CDFW on that. So I think that's an element that we address in the mitigation plan.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
From Katie Brokaw, if pumping doesn't impact the GDEs, then do we have to mitigate impacts of drought to the GDEs under Sigma? Or is that impact more appropriately addressed under other projects outside of Sigma?
I think, well, pumping does impact the GDEs during a drought. It's not the only impact though. So again, there's the effects of the drought, and then there's the effects of the pumping. And so pumping is not the only thing that affects those shallow water levels. And so there's a partial responsibility due to pumping, but there's also a heavy responsibility associated with the effects of the drought.
Okay.
And then from Christian Broderick, I think just a point of information. 65% draft designs for the SESP Cienega are currently under review. The final plans are set to be in place by September. Relevant to earlier conversation. And also there's a website here for accessing those draft plans. And another point of information from Van Detmer, the 4 yellow wells east of the fish races in the image are the hatchery wells. My understanding is CDFW prefers water from their wells, does not flow to the river. And then from Matt Freeman, I have a hard time believing that the GSA can legally fund or mandate pumpers paying for invasive vegetation removal is within the scope of the GSA as part of SGMA. I would like to hear from the GSA's legal counsel and provide an opinion, please.
All right.
Those are all the comments in the chat. And then
Okay. And then we have EJ has his hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi EJ.
Hi.
I know I can see you.
Great. Chair Long and the GSA directors, I think this is a great discussion. I'm really pleased that you're having it. I want to direct my comments not to the steelhead, but to the approximately 300 acres of groundwater dependent ecosystems or riparian habitat that is kind of just to the east of the fish hatchery. That is probably one of the top 4 or 5 groundwater dependent ecosystems on the entire river. It's a real jewel that we need to protect, those GDEs. And I want to point out that what DWR, from the way I understand what Tony said, DWR was not directing us to the mitigation at the Cienega. Tony presented to DWR a possible mitigation that they reacted to positively. It also seems like they don't even know if that mitigation will be appropriate for their project. I personally would think that protecting the groundwater dependent ecosystems in that 300-acre riparian habitat that's there now would be a better mitigation than the scenic work. And I would be happy to join with Tony and talk to DWR and see if they think that that's just as an effective mitigation measure. And I want to kind of give an analogy. When the drought occurs and the pumping continues, and it hits that critical water level that Tony has in one of his charts, one strategy would be to just cut off ag pumping. And you'd have a lot of dead trees. And then you could tell the growers, hey, the water's come back, you can start pumping again, but it's not over for them. Their trees are dead, they've had huge impacts, and they have to replant. And you can easily understand that impact. The same thing is true for us. If groundwater pumping continues to occur for agriculture, then our trees take the hit. And just like the growers, the lemon tree growers and the avocado tree growers, we have to come back and replant and restore the system so that we can grow those trees. We're not asking that a restoration be done here through this mitigation. We're asking that the non-natives, that the GSA take the responsibility for providing a fund so that the non-natives can be held at bay. So when the water does come back, that the habitat can come back naturally. We know it doesn't come back naturally if you don't keep the non-natives at bay. So I hope you would give serious consideration to that. And I will make myself available to talk to DWR with Tony or whoever else you want to be there to see if they think that that would be an equally acceptable mitigation measure. And I appreciate you giving me the time to talk. Thank you.
EJ, thank you so much. I do have a question because we sit on many boards together in regards to the Santa Clara River watershed, and then we're working with IRWM. Don't those associations already address the invasives and getting grants and so forth to do that? So you're
No, that's a misnomer. That's a misnomer. The property owners, for example, the Nature Conservancy, we have to go to them and pursue grants through them. As you know, through IRWM, there's a project selection process. There's nobody out there with funds that's dedicated to remove invasives from the Santa Clara River. It's all a catch as catch can. And because the environmental community is willing to take the hit on this, I think it's appropriate that there be some responsibility borne by the GSA, and some sort of a fund that that could be tapped and maybe used as a match for some of these grants to make it easier for us to get grants to do the restoration part.
Okay, I am gonna save my comments. Is there any other questions from any of our directors, any of our public? Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, I know I'm gonna have to be leaving here shortly, so I wanted to jump in too. I guess part of me for, I think Matt Freeman's question had some merit, just making sure that whatever we're doing can be done and is within the legal bounds. I can see arguments on both sides, and so I would look for some guidance there. And then I think what I was mentioning previously about mitigation stuff, I would have the same kind of thought process with what EJ was recommending. I mean, if we knew what that kind of impact, that cost, that whatever is, then it would be easier to say, yeah, no, that's a reasonable approach. If it mitigates an impact, if we identify an impact and there's a mitigation, where I'm concerned on any of this, because none of us know, is we get way outside the scope and we have a bunch of unintended consequences. I think it'd be unreasonable to think that if the farmers are going to have an infinite amount of money, pumpers, not just farmers, because I don't represent the farmers, I'm more of a community, but if everybody's it's not an unlimited number, but I don't think that's what's being asked for either. I think the lack of knowledge makes it a little concerning for several of us. And so I think having that conversation and understanding what we are talking about would be very helpful. Orders of magnitude to know what we're looking at would be easier to make some decisions on. So I appreciate the ideas of looking at alternatives. And then if there could be a discussion to know what those impacts would be, I would love to hear that.
Well, and also that could be at the next update on GSP, based on the first submittal and then where we go from there as well, because we don't have that information. I would agree. Tony, is there any?
I would say that we do have the information. Like EJ is saying, there are 300 acres. We know how much it costs to restore and remove invasives at a specific density. We could get a cost estimate for what that mitigation would cost, and that's a simple, discussion. And EJ's offered to make himself available, and there are the USB studies that I've shared previously that would guide that framing that discussion around what that mitigation cost would be. I mean, I think, we need to go back to our guiding principles. And I think that environmental stakeholders are being very understanding that it is not reasonable to ask for water for the environment when the modeling shows that it's not going to make a difference for the GDEs under certain drought conditions. And what we're asking for in response, we saying we're not going to ask you to reduce your pumping, but in response, can we help and build resilience into the nature-based investments that nonprofits and organizations have been putting towards these parkway projects. I mean, we, as environmental stakeholders in an environmental community, we have spent millions on planning restoration activities on this floodplain. We have identified critical ecological nodes of importance. We know these are important GDE areas. And even knowing that they are important areas, we're saying it's unreasonable for us to ask for water when we know it's not going to have an impact. But if we're willing to give, can you give back so that we can mitigate and build that resilience into those vegetation communities after the drought?
Chair Long, I have
Yes.
a quick suggestion. I think we could get grinding these details forever. We've already proved that over many meetings, but I wonder if we would be able to agree on the basic structure of the SMCs for the surface water depletion part as a board, as presented by our consultants at this time.
Yeah, so Tony, could you put that back up on the screen?
Give me a moment here.
I just want to make sure. So what I'm hearing from Director McFadden is, would it be a motion to approve as written on, I can't see the screen, but when he pulls it up, the MTs and MOs as written.
We're getting there. Stand by.
That darn technology is always quick for us, and then it lets us down.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I think we've got 5 years of details to work out, but we need to get some basic principles here. I'd love to do that while Glenn is with us, so we can have a complete board, and he's running out of time.
Yes, I agree. And so I wanted to make sure you can make the motion right now. I just wanted to have that on the screen as it's recorded so that you could see it.
Yeah, I've got a written copy in front of me, but if we had,
go ahead.
I think it would be more appropriate. Tony, can you put that up there?
Working it. How about, there we go. I think this is what you're asking for. Can you see that?
No.
There it is.
All right. Should be there now.
You got it.
Okay, so these are the two SMCs that we have left to approve. So Director McFadden?
Yeah, so I'm looking specifically right now at the surface water depletion SMC. And I am making a motion that we adopt the MTs, the MT and the MO as proposed by staff and consultant on this chart.
Are you also including the GD elevation as well? We needed both of those, I thought.
I am. I was doing one specifically, but I'll make a reach and do both at the same time.
Okay.
Thanks for the inspiration.
Thank you. Is there a second? Any director second that? Well, I would second it. I'll second it. And Eva, if you could have a roll call.
Sure.
I mean, I would like to propose alternate language.
First, we have to see if this motion passes, and then if it doesn't pass, then we can have alternative motion, I believe, or
Well, can we have two
legal.
motions on the floor?
Yeah, so you have a question on the floor and the chair's called for the vote. If the vote does not pass, if the board does not approve the motion, then you can have an amendment to that motion or a new motion or whatever you want. But
So then after this one, you could have a separate motion if you wanted, correct?
well, so once the board takes action, yes, Director Menigan could propose another motion after the vote on this one.
Right. Okay. So there has been a first for Director McFadden and a second by Director Long, and roll call, please.
Okay, Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Yes.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
I'm abstaining.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Direct, okay,
Okay. So
Director Villaseñor,
Yes.
that motion passes with 5 and 1 abstaining. And then Candice, what is your motion?
My motion was to include a minimum threshold of a water temperature of 26 degrees Celsius, and then include a monitoring plan for presence absence of steelhead with the potential of supplemental water as a mitigation plan.
Okay. And is there a second for that? Is there any discussion on that? With no second, that does not pass. Am I correct, Scott?
Yeah, it fails for lack of a second.
Okay. This is, all the information is recorded as we move forward. If new information is provided, we can discuss it. Tony Morgan, what else on the SMCs do we need to do?
I'm an incredibly happy camper right now that I've
Wow.
got a board consensus and can move forward, putting some of these sections to bed.
Okay, I would like to find out from our legal counsel in regards to that question that was asked about the funds. It was from
Matt Freeman.
Matt Freeman, because I believe that also will answer the question from EJ and Candace in regards to having a legal fund. Is that something supervisors, directors would want? I wanted to ask because I think that's important for us.
I would like to have that information from legal if we could hear that. And if it's shown that we can do something like that, I would be curious to see what that dollar amount is. You know, if we have some of those things, Candace made it sound like that we could probably have some orders of magnitude relatively quickly. I think that would be valuable in making any of these discussions and stuff. I realize that that's not really what's talked about already in here, but we do have the comments under here that has Cienega restoration project stuff. So it wouldn't surprise me if that comes up again. So it would be good to have that information.
I think that you're right. And I think we need to have that. So if we can have that as a future agenda item,
Yes.
that way we can have this discussion when we're talking about mediation and so forth. I don't think that our discussions are closed. They're just evolving. And so I would appreciate that. Is there any other item? It looks like our motion is that. And then that would be adjourning our meeting to our next meeting, which is June 17th, which is our regular meeting.
One question, Chair Long. So thank you to your board for giving us clear direction.
Yes.
We will continue forward with meeting with CDFW to explore and better define a potential mitigation project. Would you like us to meet with EJ Remsen and discuss costs on that? It seems like that you would be supportive of that too. So we're very willing to meet with him and talk about this and bring back some information at a future meeting.
Yes, that would be good. And then also there were emails to myself and you in regards to when a draft GSP based on the information that we just decided on would be. Could you repeat that so that all those that are on here today would know?
Yes, Chair Long, the current schedule has us releasing a public draft on July 29th, I believe, and then a 60-day comment period for the public with a workshop in the middle. So that's the plan. Would be and making a decision tonight does certainly help the consultant get back to that task of preparing the draft plans.
Okay, and so at the next regular meeting, we're going to be talking about what?
At the next regular meeting, we will bring back information if we're able to get together with CDFW. And we
Okay.
will also be talking about some business items. So we have budget adoption, we have rates adoption, and if everyone has been tracking that, that's the proposal is to stay at $12 per acre foot extraction fee. And those are the main things that we have coming up. And also asking the board to authorize us to ask for bids for construction of the monitoring wells.
Okay, thank you. I just figure it's important for our stakeholders here today to know the next steps and that we're still continuing some really good conversations. So with that, are there any other questions? I would adjourn this meeting.
Chair Long, I've got a quick comment.
Yes, please.
I'd like to thank Board Member Case for hanging in there. I know he stayed late. And just a reminder, what we agreed on is some very broad concepts to give our consultants and staff directions for the SMCs. And there are 1,000 details to work out. So our work's not done.
Correct. It's just a starting point.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said. All right, then it is adjourned. We'll see you in just a few days, I guess. Have a good one.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
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 Hey, thank you.
Good night. Good night, everybody.